In 1935, the average new house in America cost around $3,400. And you didn't get drywall and particle board either. You got solid wood, plaster walls, and a front porch big enough to actually sit on. Today, that wouldn't even cover a month's rent in half the country. A gallon of gas, just 19 cents. That meant a single dollar could take you and your Model A down dirt roads for miles with enough left over for a hot dog and a soda. And you didn't pump it yourself. A kid in a cap did it for you, cleaned your windshield, and maybe even checked your oil. All with a yes, sir. In 1935, Monopoly hit the shelves. It was the middle of the Great Depression, and families were losing real houses. But playing a board game where you could pretend to own Boardwalk somehow made people feel better. Nobody cared that it took 5 hours to finish. It was cheap entertainment. Movies? 25 cents got you a ticket. That included a newsreel, a cartoon, and the feature film. And in 35, everyone was lining up to see Shirley Temple dance across the screen. She wasn't just a child star. She was a national distraction from breadlines and unemployment. The average wage was about $1,600 a year. It doesn't sound like much, but you could stretch it. Clothes were mended, shoes were resoled, and nothing went to waste. People actually darned socks instead of just throwing them out. In 1935, you didn't flip on a TV at night, because only about 200 television sets even existed in the whole country. Instead, families gathered around a big wooden radio the size of a dresser. Roosevelt's voice crackled through during his fireside chats, and people felt like the president was speaking right in their living room. Cars. The Ford Model 48 rolled out in 35, and it looked like the future. Rounded fenders, a flathead V8, and a price tag just under $600. Owning one didn't just mean mobility. It meant you weren't stuck walking to the factory every day. And here's one people forget. In 1935, Social Security was created. It didn't mean much at first, just a signature on paper, but it would end up changing the lives of millions of Americans who could finally imagine retirement someday. You didn't go out for fast food in 1935. The drive-thru didn't exist. If you wanted a hamburger, you went to a diner, slid into a red leather booth, and the waitress knew your name. A nickel cup of coffee kept you warm, and nobody had ever heard of a pumpkin spice latte. Kids played outside until dark, not with video games, but with marbles, jump ropes, and anything they could build out of scrap wood. A stick and a hoop could keep a child busy for hours. Parents didn't hover. They just yelled out the window when it was time for supper. In 1935, milk was delivered to your door. Glass bottles clinking together in a metal carrier. The milkman didn't just drop it off. He'd sometimes even stop for a quick chat. Try imagining Uber Eats sticking around to ask how your kids are doing. Bread was about 8 cents a loaf, and it wasn't some low-carb, gluten-free, sprouted grain science experiment. It was simple white bread, and nobody felt guilty slathering it with butter. The average life expectancy? About 61 years. Doctors still smoked, hospitals didn't always have antibiotics, and catching pneumonia could be a death sentence. But people were tough. They didn't Google symptoms. They just toughed it out with soup and home remedies. In 1935, parking meters were invented. Oklahoma City put the first one on the street, and people hated it instantly. Paying to park your own car? Outrageous. If only they knew about $40 tickets waiting in a 2025. Babe Ruth played his final season that year. He wasn't the same slugger he used to be, but the man could still draw a crowd. Baseball was king, and kids all over America dreamed of hitting just one ball like the Bambino. Movies weren't just entertainment. They were escape. People struggling to find work spent a dime to sit in an air-conditioned theater and forget their troubles. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers danced away the depression, at least for 90 minutes. In 1935, there were more horses on farms than tractors. Mechanization was coming, but not everyone could afford it. Horses still plowed fields, hauled wagons, and earned their oats. A haircut cost 25 cents. And barbershops weren't just for hair. They were social clubs. Men swapped news, complained about politics, and maybe got a straight razor shave with a hot towel for another quarter. The first canned beer appeared in 1935. Kruger's Cream Ale and Kruger's Finest Beer came in flat-top cans that required a church key opener. It was revolutionary. Suddenly, you could drink without worrying about heavy glass bottles breaking. Franklin D. Roosevelt was in his first full term as president. His New Deal programs, like the Works Progress Administration, were putting Americans back to work building roads, bridges, and post offices. Many of those structures are still standing today. In 1935, swing music was taking off. Benny Goodman was the king of swing, and radios all across the country were blasting big band sounds. Teenagers danced, parents complained, and suddenly jazz wasn't just for smoky clubs anymore. Families didn't eat out often. Restaurants were a luxury. Most meals came from scratch: beans, cornbread, stews stretched with potatoes. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers weren't optional. They were survival. Shoes were polished daily. A scuffed pair of leather shoes was embarrassing. Kids got one good pair and one play pair, and they better last until next year. Ice boxes were still common. That's right. Refrigerators weren't everywhere yet. Blocks of ice were delivered and slid into insulated cabinets to keep food cold. You measured time in how long the ice would last. In 1935, air conditioning was rare. If you were hot, you opened a window, used a fan, or sat on the porch. Movie theaters bragged about being cooled by refrigeration just to get people in seats. Amelia Earhart was America's sweetheart. In 1935, she became the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to California. The newspapers treated her like a rock star, and she inspired a generation of women who wanted adventure. A telephone wasn't something you carried. It was bolted to the wall with a cord that tangled constantly, and many people shared a party line, meaning your neighbors could listen in on your calls if they picked up. In 1935, nylon stockings didn't exist. Women wore silk or rayon, which snagged easily and weren't cheap. Nylon wouldn't come around until later, but in 35, a good pair of stockings was a prized possession. Schools were strict. Teachers carried paddles, homework was handwritten, and kids recited lessons out loud. If you misbehaved, word got back home, and your parents sided with the teacher, not you. Radio comedians were household names: Jack Benny, Burns, and Allen. Families laughed together in the living room while staring at a glowing radio dial. It wasn't just entertainment, it was appointment listening. In 1935, coffee was 25 cents a pound. That meant a cup in the morning didn't feel like a luxury. It was just part of life. Nobody was paying $5 for a double-pump vanilla latte with almond foam. Radios ran on vacuum tubes. When one burned out, Dad pulled it out like a light bulb and replaced it himself. Try fixing your smartphone like that today. Photographs weren't instant. You wound up your Kodak, snapped the shot, and waited days, sometimes weeks, to see how it came out. And if your thumb was in the frame, too bad. In 1935, people dressed up to go anywhere. Men wore hats, ties, and polished shoes to the grocery store. Women wore dresses and gloves just to run errands. Sweatpants in public, unheard of. Streetcars were still common. In most cities, people hopped onto rattling trolleys to get downtown. They were cheap, loud, and packed, but they worked. Kids knew how to entertain themselves. They built kites out of newspaper, raced homemade carts downhill, and played stickball in alleys. No Wi-Fi, no TikTok, just imagination. Cigarettes were everywhere. Doctors smoked, teachers smoked, even athletes lit up in public. A pack cost about 15 cents, and nobody talked about lung cancer. The Dust Bowl was in full swing. Farmers in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas watched their topsoil literally blow away. Families packed everything onto trucks and headed west, hoping California meant jobs and food. In 1935, highways were still young. You didn't drive 70 miles per hour on smooth pavement. Roads were narrow, bumpy, and full of potholes. Long trips meant spare tires, maps, and patience. Talking on the phone wasn't private. Operators connected your call manually, sometimes listening in for gossip. "Hello, Central," was how conversations started. Mail was king. Letters were handwritten, stamps were 3 cents, and the daily trip to the mailbox was an event. Nobody complained about too many emails. Magazines cost a dime. Life, Time, and Saturday Evening Post were stacked in barbershops and diners. People didn't just flip through them, they read them cover to cover. Shoes were repaired, not tossed. Every town had a cobbler. A good pair of leather boots could last a decade if resoled a few times. A wristwatch was a prized possession. You didn't check the time on a glowing screen. You wound it up at night, and if you forgot, you were late. Soap operas began on the radio, called soap, because detergent companies sponsored them. Housewives tuned in every afternoon to catch the drama. In 1935, Elvis Presley was born. No one knew it yet, but that baby in Mississippi would change American music forever. Public libraries were packed. Books were free, warm, and offered a quiet escape. Kids lined up to borrow Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, or Tarzan. Jukeboxes played for a nickel. Drop in a coin, hear your favorite swing tune, and maybe dance with someone special. It was the original Spotify playlist. In 1935, ice cream was a luxury. One scoop for 5 cents was a treat worth dressing up for. And no, it didn't come in 31 flavors. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, pick one. Neighbors knew each other. If you needed sugar, you knocked next door. If you were sick, someone brought soup. You didn't text first. You just showed up. In 1935, movies had no color. Hollywood was still black and white, but nobody complained. The magic wasn't pixels, it was storytelling. President Roosevelt's WPA put artists to work. Painters, writers, and actors got government jobs creating murals, plays, and guidebooks. Culture didn't just survive the Depression, it thrived. College wasn't common. Only about 5% of Americans had a degree. Most kids went straight to work after high school, if they even finished. In 1935, women wore hats everywhere. Sunday best wasn't complete without one. Men tipped their hats in greeting. It was fashion and respect rolled into one. Bank accounts were shaky. After the crash of 1929, people didn't trust banks. Many kept savings hidden in cookie jars or under mattresses. In 1935, postage stamps were art. Collectors prized them. Kids traded them, and mail was decorated with tiny works of design. Baseball games were heard, not seen. Families sat around radios, picturing every pitch in their minds as announcers painted the scene with words. In 1935, jobs weren't easy to find. Men stood in long lines hoping for day work. Women took in laundry or sewing to keep food on the table. Shoes squeaked on polished wood floors. Homes were built solid, oak, maple, pine, no laminate. When you walked in, it echoed. Privacy didn't exist the way it does today. Neighbors knew your business, store clerks knew your habits, and gossip spread faster than Facebook ever could. In 1935, a movie star wasn't just famous, they were untouchable. Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, and Fred Astaire weren't posting selfies. They were larger than life, glowing on giant silver screens. Kids collected marbles, not as an app, not digital. Real glass marbles, bright and swirled. A good shooter was worth bragging about on the playground. In 1935, men wore suspenders more than belts. Belts were functional. Suspenders? They were class. And yes, they actually held your pants up. Schools had one-room classrooms. In rural towns, kids of every grade sat together. The older kids helped the younger, and the teacher knew your whole family. Candy bars cost a nickel. Hershey's, Baby Ruth, Milky Way, all sweet escapes when times were bitter. Street vendors sold roasted peanuts. That warm paper bag smell could stop you in your tracks. It was the original street food. In 1935, there were no shopping malls. If you needed clothes, you went downtown. A department store like Woolworth's or Sears had everything under one roof. People actually used fountain pens, ink bottles, blotting paper, smudged fingers. Writing wasn't quick, but it felt permanent. Family portraits were serious. Nobody smiled wide. It was considered silly. A straight face meant dignity, even if the baby was squirming. In 1935, toothpaste came in metal tubes. You rolled them up tight to squeeze every last bit. No pumps, no fancy whitening claims. Just mint and grit. Ice cream parlors were hangouts. Marble counters, spinning stools, and a soda jerk mixing up malts. For a dime, you could forget the world for an hour. In 1935, skyscrapers were marvels. The Empire State Building was only 4 years old, and people still craned their necks in awe. Newspapers were everything. Morning, evening, Sunday editions. They told you the world, and kids earned pennies tossing them onto porches. In 1935, typewriters clicked in every office. Carbon paper, sticky keys, and bell dings at the end of every line. No delete button. Mistakes meant starting over. Street lamps weren't automatic. In many towns, a worker walked the street at dusk, lighting lamps by hand. Quilts were treasures. Mothers and grandmothers stitched together scraps of old clothes. Each piece told a family story. In 1935, movies were censored by the Hays Code. No steamy kisses, no risque scenes. Hollywood had to play by strict rules, but somehow the stars still sizzled. Radio quiz shows became popular. Ordinary people won cash and prizes just by answering trivia. It was the original game night. In 1935, a loaf of bread fed a family. Sliced bread had only been around for 7 years, and people still called it the greatest invention. Water fountains were social spots. At school, in town, people gathered, sipped, and talked. They were the original water cooler conversations. In 1935, canned foods kept families alive. Peaches, beans, corn, pantry shelves were stocked with glass jars or cans. Especially in hard times, families gathered on porches at night. No TV, no air conditioning, just rocking chairs, fireflies, and conversation until dark. In 1935, trains were still the way to travel. They were grand with dining cars, sleeping berths, and conductors who treated you like a guest. Shoes squeaked in gymnasiums. Basketball was gaining traction, but the equipment was bare bones. Leather balls, peach baskets, wooden floors. In 1935, nobody wasted food. Potato peels went to soup, bones went to broth, and bread crusts fed chickens. Waste was unthinkable. The average car had running boards. Kids stood on them while Dad drove. No seatbelts, no airbags, just adventure. In 1935, hair tonic was in every bathroom. It slicked men's hair into place and left a smell you'd recognize anywhere. Milkshakes were hand-spun. No blenders humming in seconds. A soda jerk whisked it by hand until it was frothy and thick. In 1935, church bells marked the hours. You didn't need a smartwatch. The whole town knew what time it was. Postcards were cheap souvenirs. Families mailed them from vacations, proudly showing beaches, parks, or city skylines. In 1935, roller skates had metal wheels. Strap them to your shoes, tighten with a key, and hope you didn't hit a crack in the sidewalk. Farmers' markets were daily life. Eggs, vegetables, butter, direct from neighbors, not supermarket chains. In 1935, hot dogs were everywhere. Baseball parks, street corners, diners, 5 cents got you a meal in a bun. Shoes were shined on street corners. Boys with brushes and polish shouted, "Shine, mister!" A nickel got you looking sharp. In 1935, bicycles had balloon tires. Heavy, sturdy, and built to last. A kid's prized possession was his bike. Barber poles actually spun, red, white, and blue stripes turning outside every shop, promising a shave or cut. In 1935, kids read comic strips and newspapers. Popeye, Little Orphan Annie, and Dick Tracy fueled imaginations long before superheroes dominated. Drinking water came from wells in many towns. Cold, fresh, pumped by hand, and nobody paid a water bill. In 1935, families played board games, checkers, dominoes, card games. The living room was the arena. And maybe the biggest thing people forgot about 1935's America, life was slower. People weren't glued to glowing screens. They worked hard, scraped by, and still found joy in small things. A nickel cone, a radio tune, a neighbor's hello. It wasn't perfect, but it was human.